So styled components are a pretty nice way of mixing JavaScript and CSS and getting components, elements, HTML elements, with certain possibly dynamic styles added to them. Now, a lot of people like styled components, and you can probably already tell why. Now, I also like styled components, but I'm personally also a fan of having CSS that is scoped to a certain file or scoped to a certain component and still lives inside of CSS files though. I'm personally not the biggest fan of this CSS and JavaScript mixture since it bloats the JavaScript files a little bit. We have all that extra code in there. And since in a lot of IDEs or environments, you only get poor IDE support when writing code here. The auto-completion and so on for CSS commands and CSS values is much better in CSS files typically. So you can absolutely use it, but I personally am not the biggest fan of it, and so I want to show you yet another way of scoping styles to your components. So of writing styles which only apply to a specific component instead of the entire application. Because that is an important thing. Often you really want to make sure that your styles don't apply everywhere in your application, but only to certain parts. For example, if we would grab this code here and temporarily ignore that we want to change it dynamically sometimes, if we grab this code here and add it to app CSS, then we could pass this here into a button class, let's say. So let's move this in here. And then here we have anything with a button class and a hover state, which gets this style. And then here, of course, we don't have this dynamic code, but we just have green here, and we just have light green down there. And this would be valid code, but now everything with a button class will get these styles, which means if I add the button class here to this button down there, and for that I will revert it to a regular button, not using the styled component, remove the alt attribute and just add a class name here of button, then of course this button would get that style, but any other button anywhere else in the app with the same class name would get the same style too. So if we have a button in Person.js, we don't, but if we had one here, which also has this button CSS class, it would get the same style. And often that's not what you want. You want to make sure instead that your styles are scoped to a certain component. And that can be achieved with another concept as well, CSS modules. For that, I will remove the styled button here because I don't need it anymore. Remove the styled component. And now for CSS modules to work, we need to tweak the configuration of our project a little bit. The underlying build configuration. So the configuration which takes our code, transforms it, and bundles it together. To be precise, we need to tweak the configuration if we're using React Scripts version 1 here. I recommend this version because with that you actually get a starting setup where you have a class-based component here, which makes it easier to follow along in this course where we first start with class-based components and later focus on functional components with hooks in greater detail. So that's why I'm using version 1 here. If you are using React Scripts version 2 or higher, you have an alternative approach of enabling this feature I'm about to show you. Here, however, I am using version 1, so I will show you the approach that works with this version. For that, you need to quit your development server and then run npm run eject in your project folder running this script. What this will do is it will eject from this under the hood configuration where you don't really have access to the underlying webpack config file and so on, and give you access to the config files so that you can tweak how your code is bundled together and so on. And there is something we will need to tweak there. So if you run npm run eject here, you're asked if you want to eject, and you can answer Y here for yes. And you might get an error, as I'm getting here, that you have uncommitted changes. For that, I'll just add a new commit. This only applies if you are using Git for version control. If you're not using that, you will not get that error. So I'll quickly create a commit and then rerun npm run eject, answer Y for yes here. And now what you get is a new script and a new config folder. And in that config folder here, you'll find a webpack config.dev.js file and a webpack config.prod.js file. These are the configuration files which are used under the hood by this React tooling here. You see the package.json file now also changed. We have way more packages here now. These are in the end packages used under the hood by Create React App to give you that development server and build your app and bundle it together. And it uses this configuration for Webpack, which is the tool which is used for all of that. Now in there are a lot of things you can tweak, and you should only tweak them if you really know what you're doing. There's one specific option that's important to us though. If you scroll down until you find this test CSS thing here, you will see that we're using CSS Loader, and there you'll find some options. And now this is the part which you can tweak and which you should tweak. If your config file looks a bit differently, also check out the text lecture after this lecture where I show differently looking config files and how you would adjust those. So have a look at this lecture in that case. If it looks like this, then here's what you need to tweak. In the options here, you have import loaders 1. Now there you also need to add a modules entry and set this to true, and then a local ident name entry which you set to a string, which should look like this. Square brackets, name, underscore underscore, square brackets, local between the brackets, underscore underscore, brackets, hash, colon, base 64, 5. Now that's looking very strange. What does this all mean? This enables the CSS modules feature, which we're about to use. And this will be used by that feature to dynamically generate unique CSS class names in the end. Now, we also need to do the same in the prod file, so you can copy these two lines, go to the webpack config prod file, and also search for the CSS test there. And there also add these two entries to the options of the CSS loader. Now with that, you can rerun npm start and it should now still work just fine without any issues. Now what do we get by adding these configuration items though? If we go to app.js, we can now import from that CSS file in a different way. We can import classes from, for example, and you can name this here however you want. Now this is a different way of importing from the CSS file, which is now supported by the underlying build script because of our tweaks we just made. What this will do is it will import all the classes we export here, for example button, which I'll label with the uppercase B, don't need to do that, just want to do it to be in line with app. It will import these classes here in the end as properties on this object. What does this mean? It means that if we go down to our button, I don't add button like this. Instead here, we add something dynamically. We point at classes.button. Now we need to be careful here because I already got a classes constant here. So to avoid name clashes, I'll rename this to assigned classes here and here and here. And what I push here is also not red, but instead classes.red, referring to that import we're importing from the CSS file. And here it's classes.bold. Now we also need to tweak this here and point at classes.app. So effectively, I'm pointing at properties on this classes object, and the properties I'm pointing at are class names I set up in app CSS. App, red, bold, button. Now, what am I doing here? The CSS modules feature is a feature applied by some tool which is part of the build process, so of the process which takes our code and then compiles it, transforms it, and bundles it together. And this process simply detects this kind of import from a CSS file and understands that we don't just want to add the CSS as it is, but instead it now looks into the CSS file, transforms every class name here to a unique one, to a random unique one, and returns us a map of these generated unique class names mapped to the class names we chose here as properties in this object which we import. So every class name we have in a CSS file is now a property of this imported object, and the value for every property will be this randomly generated unique class name generated by this package. The result is that if I now save this, you see everything still works. But if we analyze this button, you see the class it has is now actually app button some random hash. This is what I mean. This is this randomly generated name following our naming convention we set up in the Webpack config in the end. This is guaranteed to be unique only in this component, only in the web component. So we can't clash with other components because only here I'm importing from app CSS in that way. If I use, let's say, a button class name written like this in another part of my app, it will not clash with the styles here because this will actually not be applied as a button class to the element, but as this generated name. This is the idea behind CSS modules, and therefore they allow us to move code into CSS files and still import it in a way that is scoped to this component. Now the question, of course, is how can we now implement such dynamic style changes now that we're not setting the styles in the JavaScript code anymore, but in CSS files? Well, we just have to add different CSS classes based on the styles we want. So we can go to app CSS, and in there we can add a new class, red, and here I specify a selector that this only has an effect if it is on an element which also has the button class. And in there, in button red, we can now set background color to red. And I also add button.red hover to set specific hover styles where I want to use background color and set this to Salmon. Now the default button hover style will still apply, but this will override the background color. The color here will be kept. So now with that, we added a new class. And by the way, this is not to be confused with this red class. This has a lowercase r, this has an uppercase r, and this also has only an effect if it's on a button. So now in app.js, we can change our classes here on the button dynamically based on the condition we have for that. So we could say we have, let's say, not that style const here, but up there, below our persons maybe, we have a button class variable, which initially is an array where we just have classes dot button with an uppercase B. And remember, this will simply be a pointer at this unique class name, which is generated by the CSS modules package. And it's this button class which I want to apply down there. So here I'll add button class join like this. So because we have an array here, I want to join all the classes that are in there together with a white space in between. We can of course also name this button classes if you prefer that. Well, and now here in this place where we need to change styles dynamically, we set button class, or we don't set it, but we push a new class onto it, and that's classes.red, uppercase R, using this special red class we just added. So now this will be an array, button class will be an array with the button class and with the red class. And both combined here will have this effect. So now with that, if we save this and we reload, you will see that if I toggle this, we get the red button with the salmon background. If we don't toggle, we have the green button with the green background. And you'll also see on the right that a new class gets added when we toggle. So this is how we could implement this with CSS modules. We simply add different CSS classes. Another way of implementing this would be to say, well, inside of my app class, every button should have this style. So here we could say app button like this, using the button tag selector here, not a class. This is just a tag selector now. Just app is a class selector. And then here we say, well, any button with the red class inside of our app class will have these styles. So now we use a more complex or a little bit more complex CSS selector. And we say every button inside of an element which has the app class should have that style. And every button inside of an element with the app class, which also has the red class, should have these styles. Now, since my button here is inside of an element with the app class, this button will get these styles. And then we could simplify this here to say we just want to add button class here. And button class is not an array, but button class is equal to classes.red here, so to my special class, which I want to add eventually. And by default, button class simply is empty. So by default, if we go to the place where button class is defined here, because we're not working with a default button class, but any button inside of an app class decorated element will have that style. And we would have the same effect as before.